Hey guys, today we're jumping back into my favorite program, Apple Motion again. I'm going to show you how to make these two different name supers, or lower thirds you might refer to them as, to upgrade your video content. So first we've got this more traditional looking one, and then we've got one that's a little more modern. And exclusively for my Patreon community, I'm going to show you how to make this kind of cool, techie, digital looking one over on Patreon. So if you're a patron, you'll be able to access that. If you're not, check out my Patreon page if you're interested in seeing this one as well. Now, today I'm going to show you how to make these different lower thirds in Motion, and then we're going to be exporting them as QuickTime movies with transparent backgrounds so you can import them into Final Cut. But next week, I'm going to show you how to publish them as templates so that you can modify them in Final Cut. That's like a whole other process. It's a whole other separate video. But if you're interested in that, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss that video. Okay, so here we are in Apple Motion. I'm just going to open a Motion project. The first thing I'm going to do is select this rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw myself a rectangle. And let's head on over to the inspector window, and we're going to change this to fill and turn off that outline. And I'm going to change the color of this to sort of like a sort of periwinkle color. There we go. Now I'm just kind of roughing things out right now, so we're not going to get too hung up on the placement or scale. What I am going to do is head on over to View. In the top right corner, hit this drop down, and I'm going to hit Safe Zones. Now you can also turn this on just by hitting the apostrophe key as a shortcut. You can turn it on or off there. But basically what these safe zones are is for those of us who are a little more old school, who have worked in broadcasting, the safe zones are where you want any of your content to be, to make sure that when it's broadcasted on a TV, nothing is cut off. Because now, like on YouTube or in digital media, we don't have that problem. We see the entire frame. But when you're broadcasting something on TV, all different televisions are different, and so things can get cut off. So the safe zones are a guideline to make sure that everything that you're adding in your screen that's important falls within these frames. For this purpose, I don't think you really need to worry about it too much, but I like it because it kind of gives me a little bit of a visual guide in terms of placement and what is going to look proper on our screen. So now I've got this rectangle, I've got my safe zones on. I'm just going to drop it like here. It's looking a little thick, but we're going to worry about that later. All right, the next thing we're going to do is add some sort of animating lines that are going to lay over this rectangle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head on over to my library in the top left corner. I'm going to hit Generators, and let's grab a color solid. I'm going to grab color solid, and I'm going to drop it above my rectangle in the project pane. And we are going to change the color of this to kind of like a light gray. What do we think of that? Maybe one darker. Okay. And the next thing I'm going to do is add in some animating lines. This is kind of a tedious process, the way we're going to do it. I'm going to grab the rectangle shape tool again. I'm going to draw in like a skinny rectangle. And again, we're going to change the fill to be marked on. We're going to turn off the outline. I'm going to change the color of this to just like slightly lighter or darker than white. And I'm going to rotate it so it's at an angle. And now we're going to keyframe some movement on this. So to do that, I'm going to make sure I'm selected on the rectangle in my project pane. We're going to be in the inspector window under properties, and I'm queued up, if you look in my timeline, to the very beginning of our project. And I'm going to make a keyframe at the very first frame, and I'm going to drag the X value back so it's actually out of frame. And then by the end here, let's say we're going to go down 5 seconds in, and I'm going to hit another keyframe here, and I'm going to change the X value so it's like way down here out of frame. So over the course of 5 seconds, that rectangle flies across the screen. And now what I'm going to do is I'm again selected on the rectangle in my project pane. I'm going to right click on my mouse, and I'm going to duplicate that, let's say 4 times. So we end up with 5 lines. Now what I'm going to do is head on down to my timeline here. I'm going to change the timing of when these rectangles come in. So I'm just going to drag the first copy I made and sort of drag it down a little, the next one. So they're not all moving across the screen at the same time. They're going at the same pace, but not at the same time. I'm going to give a little more space to those. And let's check it out again. All right, very cool. So the next thing I want to change is I want to make these rectangles different widths. I don't want them to be so uniform. So what I'm going to do is select the first rectangle. I can do that in the timeline or in the project pane. And I'm going to head on over to the scale value in the inspector window. And I want to modify the X scale. So if you're not seeing that, you're going to need to hit this drop down window. And what I'm going to do is drag that X scale down to make this line thinner. The next line, let's leave it the width that it is. Let's skip to the third rectangle we created. And let's hit that X value again. Make it even thinner. And just kind of eyeball how you want these to look. There's no right or wrong answer here. This is all just your particular taste. You can obviously change the colors of these things different from what I have. And so now if you look, we've got our rectangles flying across the screen at all different widths. Okay, so the next step is I actually want to group all of these rectangles together to make them one unit that I can modify. So what I'm going to do is click the top one in my project pane, hold down the shift button to click all of the rectangles, and then I'm going to right click and I'm going to hit group. Now I want to rename this group to stay organized. So I just select the text that says group and it lets me modify the name of it. I'm just going to call it rectangles, and I'm going to collapse this group so I don't have to look at all these rectangles. It helps me stay organized. And I'm actually going to duplicate this group a couple times. Maybe 3 times. And what I'm going to do is select these groups. I'm going to drag them down further in my timeline so that I have continuous rectangles for a long time. Okay, so we've got rectangles going all the way through about 7 seconds into my timeline. Now we're gonna add another group. We're gonna be making a lot of groups with this lower third. It's a little bit of work. You just have to keep track of what you're doing, but grouping things together makes it much easier to manipulate them quickly later down the road. So now what I'd like to group is all 4 groups of my rectangles plus this gray color solid that we made. That entire thing is going to become one group. So again, select them all, right click, group. And what should we call this? I'm going to call this gray stripes. And again, I'm going to close that up so I don't have to look at all of those lines. I just know that they're there. And now we're going to apply a mask to this entire group. So I'm highlighted on the group, and I'm going to go on over here to the middle of my screen, and I'm going to select a rectangle mask, and I'm going to draw a mask about the same like size, shape as that initial periwinkle rectangle we made here. And I'm going to make it a little bit thinner. And then, so now when I have these red lines, this means I'm manipulating the mask. If I want to actually change the position of this group, I need to select the group again here, and I can actually drag it over. And so now I'm going to fine tune the size of this group. I want it to be even with the rectangle, and I want it to come right to the end of the rectangle. I'm going to turn off the safe zone so I can really get in there and look at my alignment. So now the one thing I'm noticing is the lines don't start coming in until a couple seconds into our timeline. So the other thing I want to do is take this group of gray lines and I'm going to drag it backward in my timeline so that the gray lines start sooner. Okay, cool beans. So we've gotten this far. Now what I'd like to do is soften the edge of this banner. I don't want it to just cut off here at the end. I want it to fade out. So what I'm going to do is group this group of the gray stripes, and I'm going to group this periwinkle rectangle Just select them both, group, and I'm going to rename this main banner. Now what I'd like to do is add a mask to the end of this main banner. So we're going to make sure we're selected in the project pane, that big group that we just made. We're going to go to the middle of our screen, grab that rectangle mask, and I'm going to draw where I want the feathering to start. Now, obviously I've cut out the opposite of what I wanted to fade out here. So we're going to click on over to invert mask here in the inspector window. And now we've got the opposite. And now we can play with the feather and the fall off and really fade that out. Now you can go above 100 here on these values if you just grab the numbers and drag your mouse up or down. So to me, that looks pretty good. I like that. All right, let us add our text. So let's hit the text tool here in the center of the screen and click on our banner, and I'm just going to type my name. The default color is white. We'll change that in a second, but first let's get the scale up. I'm going to zoom in a little on my canvas so I can see better. Not that far. And we're going to move the text so it's centered in the banner. Now, if you're not seeing these yellow lines here, you want to go on over to View, top right corner, and make sure your dynamic guides are checked. That really helps you just like make sure that things are centered and that you're all aligned. Okay, now let's change the color of that font. We want to make sure it's selected in the project pane. In the inspector window, head on over to Appearance, grab that color picker, and I'm just going to color pick that blue background we created at the beginning of our project. Now we want to affect this text. So we want it to kind of bounce in from the top. I'm going to make sure it's selected. I can do that by grabbing in my timeline or in my project pane. We're going to head on up to Behaviors. We're going to go to Parameter, and we're going to use Overshoot. And now in my inspector window here under Behaviors, you'll see that I've added the Overshoot. We're going to skip on down to the bottom right corner of this where it says Apply To. We're going to do the drop down. We're going to hit Properties, Transform, Position, and Y. Now we're going to modify the start value of the Overshoot. So I'm going to have it start above my banner, and I want to draw my attention to the timeline down here. My Overshoot lasts for the entire duration of my text. I do not want that at all. I actually want it to happen a lot faster. So I'm going to drag this purple bar to make it shorter. And let's just play back and see what it looks like. The bounce on it's kind of, I don't know, it's a little tight. It's not as like bouncy as I want it to be. So we're going to modify that. Make sure we click Overshoot in our timeline, and we're going to change the ramp duration to about, I don't know, let's say 29%, almost 28.81 is where I landed. That has a little more spring to it. I'm going to go down a little more even. That feels a little bit better. That feels a little nicer to me. Now what I don't want though is to see my text when it's above the banner line. I actually don't want to see it until it's within my background banner. Now how do I do that? This is the magic of masking again. But guess what? We cannot add masks to text in Apple Motion. You can't do it. So the workaround is we're actually going to create a group of the text just on its own. You're going to group this one piece of text on its own, and then you can apply the mask to it. So just select your text in your project pane, right click, and hit group. Believe it or not, you can group just one item. I'm just going to name it Jenn Jager, and we are going to mask it off. So I'm going to go back on over to my rectangular mask tool, my handy dandy tool, and I'm going to draw a mask and invert it. Now, some people would mask over the text to keep the text in the frame. I always just mask out what I don't want to see and then invert it. You know, there's a million ways to skin a cat. It's just totally personal preference how you prefer to do it. And you can see here my mask is not big enough, so we're just going to modify that. That's like super easy to change. And then I want to make sure the lettering doesn't come in until the blue banner at the top. See that? Pretty cool. All right, we're starting to get somewhere, but there's still many more steps to go. Typically on a name super, you have like the person's name, but then you also have their title, so you can like get more information about them. So we're going to add another rectangle under this main banner. So what we need to do is move all of this stuff up so we can add that other rectangle. So I'm going to go to the top of my project pane and go to my master group. This is everything incorporated in our project thus far. And I'm going to just modify the Y value on that. I'm going to lift it up and give myself a little bit of room for this next element we're about to incorporate. Okay, so in order to get that little secondary rectangle that's going to come in under our name and add my title, we are going to go back to the shape tool and I'm going to draw another rectangle. And we're going to modify that. Let's go over to shape in your inspector window. We're going to add fill again, turn off that outline. I'm going to color pick and make it this periwinkle. I want it to be the same color as the outline of my banner. And let's head on over to geometry and let us dial up the roundness on this. So I don't want it to have such square corners. Let me turn it down so you can see what this does. I've got really square corners here. The roundness just kind of takes the edge off those corners, makes them a little less sharp. And then let's grab our transform tool, which is this little arrow here, so we can move this rectangle. And I'm going to layer it under my main banner soon, but for now, let's just have it above, just while we're working on it for convenience sake. And now I'm going to add more text to this. So I'm going to click the text tool. I'm going to add my title. I'm going to change the font on this. And I'm just going to use the inspector window to really like fine tune instead of just manually grabbing things. Now, sometimes I find when I'm trying to align text in Apple Motion, these little handles that show that this particular element in my project is highlighted get a little bit in my way because I can't really see my alignment perfectly with like these little circles and lines here. So real quick, to turn those off, you're going to go up to view in the top right corner and turn off show overlays. And then again, you can in your inspector pane just like manipulate the properties there. And I'm going to zoom in by hitting Apple Plus on my canvas. And then to maneuver the canvas, I grab this little hand and I can move my canvas around. But this allows me to really zoom way in and see the detail work of what I'm doing. Now we can turn the overlays back on and recenter our canvas here. Okay, next what I want to do is group these two elements together, my text and this new rectangle I made. So I'm going to select them both, group. I'm going to call this subtext. Truth be told, you guys, I never title my groups when I'm working on my own, but I do think it's going to help you follow along with what I'm doing. And what I need is this subtext group to be underneath my master banner. So I want the subtext to lay underneath the banner here. So what I'm going to do is grab the big main banner we made in my project pane, and I'm going to drag it above the subtext. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to properties on this main banner I made, and I'm going to add a drop shadow by clicking this button. And then we can modify that drop shadow by hitting the show button here. And we can play with the distance. I just want to give it a little depth. You know what I mean? You can play with the opacity, give it more depth or less depth. I'm going to leave it about there. I think that looks pretty good. But I think I want to make some modifications to my subtext. And this is all like part of the creative process. It's not unusual to be making these tweaks as you go. I think I want to drag my rectangle in a little bit tighter. And what do we think about the all caps on the creative director? I think I would like to make this up or lower. What if I wanted to make this like italic? All right, I'm good with that. Now we don't just want this subtext subtitle thing to just pop in, right? We want it to do something fun. So I actually want to mimic the overshoot motion we did with my name here. So what I'm going to do is find the overshoot effect in my timeline here, this purple bar. I'm going to select it. I'm going to hit Apple C to copy it. And then I'm going to click on the subtext in my project pane, right click and hit paste. And what do you know? There is the overshoot. I want the subtext to come in like right after my name comes in. So I'm just going to drag this entire group back in my timeline and just play with it. It's just kind of a trial and error thing. All right, and now I've kind of got the timing right. I actually want to make some modifications to this. First of all, if you see here, you can see it peeking up above my main banner. We're going to select Overshoot on the inspector window. We're going to go to behaviors, and I'm going to modify the start value because I don't need it to come up that high. The other thing is I want to slow it down a bit. So I'm going to grab the Overshoot bar in my timeline. I'm going to extend it, and that's going to slow down my motion. Okay, so we have our name super. It is looking pretty cute, but how is it going to like come into our shot? So you have to think about these things. We could have it just fade in, and that is something we could just do in Final Cut. You don't necessarily have to make the fade in happen here, but why don't we just like do something a little bit more fun? What I'd like to do is have the banner kind of open up. So it's going to start from nothing and open up from the center, and then the text will come in as you see it doing already. So to do that, it's a little bit tricky. Let me show you how to work it. We're going to go to our project pane. We're going to select the big group. This is everything in our project here. And we're going to go over to the properties tab, and we're going to modify the scale. Now, there's an extra step we need to take, but first let me show you why we need to take it. If I queue up my playhead to the very beginning of my timeline here, we're going to make a keyframe on the Y scale, and we're going to dial down that value. And it does collapse. Look at that. It does collapse our banner, but look at what's happening. It's like floating up the screen. That's because we need to modify what's called the anchor point. So this is a little bit more of an advanced placement thing, but I do think you're ready for it. So first what I'm going to do is undo this Y modification that I made, and we're going to go over to our tools drop-down menu here. So we're going to drop down this arrow, and we're going to select this one, anchor point. Now, you're going to get these little arrows here in the middle of your canvas. So because we're selected on the whole group, the anchor point represents the entire canvas pretty much. So what we need to do is modify the placement of this anchor point. So you can't just grab this blue center to modify the anchor point. What you want to do is grab these arrows. So first I'm going to center, you just kind of eyeball it. I'm going to center that blue dot over my main banner here. And then I'm going to grab this green one and center it within the banner. I'm just going to keep fine tuning till I feel like it's really fairly centered. Now we're going to go back over to our inspector window and dial down that Y value, and now see what happens. It stays in place where we want it. Okay, so we've added our keyframe at the very beginning of our timeline. I'm going to arrow over with my keyboard like 10 frames, maybe let's do 12. We don't want it to happen too fast. And I'm going to create another keyframe here in my inspector window, and I'm going to change the Y value back to 100. Okay, now in our keyframe viewer, you can see that this is a linear movement. Now, if you're not seeing the keyframe viewer, go over here to the right side of your timeline and turn that on. And this allows you to kind of change the way that the keyframes are placed, and you can see more in detail of what exactly is being transformed. I'm going to select all my keyframes just by holding down my mouse and dragging around them. Right click, and let's just ease both. So it has kind of like a softer movement. So now we have to think about how the super is going to go away in our project. So I am going to just fade this out. We could do a whole thing where we collapse it back up, but sometimes I think once the viewer sees the effect of the super coming in, do you really need to do more? I don't know. Typically I say sometimes less is more, especially with stuff like this. So we're going to select the main group at the top of our project pane, and it's highlighted here in my timeline. You can see what it is. And I'm just going to draw this back. Let's say make it 7 seconds. So once I do that, even though some of these elements are actually longer than 7 seconds, it doesn't matter. If you don't have that group bar highlighted at the top, then they won't appear in your project. So now I'm on group. I'm going to go to behaviors, basic motion, fade in, fade out. So that causes the entire group to fade in and fade out. And the default fade out is 20 frames. I'm going to make it 15. And then the other thing is that because we dragged those gray stripes back in our timeline to before our animation even starts, the fade in on the group is like way down here in my timeline. I can't even see it. So I don't really have to modify that. But if you were seeing the fade in at the top of your project, if you had some other kind of project going on, you would just change this fade in time to 0. It's not going to make a difference for our project here. All right, so now to export this, we're going to hit the share button top right and export movie. You can also Apple E to export a movie. Let's go over to settings, and you want to make sure that you are on Apple ProRes 4444 so that you have the alpha channel, so it's something you can actually overlay on top of an interview. Hey everybody, today I'm going to walk you through different text animations that I'm going to create right here on my computer in Apple. All right, now let's get to our next super that I promised you. This one's a little more modern. It doesn't attach to the side of the frame, so you really can place it anywhere over your interviews, which I really like. So let's just get right into it step by step. So just as before, you're going to draw in a rectangle. And once I've done that, we're going to head on over to the inspector window. We're going to make this one fill, and we're going to make the color kind of a darker blue. And we want to make sure it's centered. So I'm going to hit properties, and I'm going to look at the position of the X and Y are not 0 values because I just kind of eyeballed it. We're going to reset the parameter. So now it is dead center. I'm actually also going to dial down the opacity. So we're going to go back over to shape in our inspector window, and we're going to change the fill opacity. Now, when I'm dealing with opacities in this kind of situation, I actually like to put a dummy frame under my project so I can see what it really looks like over video. So I'm just, if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to put in an image of myself sitting right here so that we can just see what this looks like in terms of opacity. Okay, so now what we're going to do is duplicate this rectangle. I'm going to select it. I'm going to right click. I'm going to hit duplicate, and we're going to make some changes here on this copy to the inspector in the inspector window. So instead of fill, I'm actually going to add the outline. I'm going to dial down the width a lot so it's very skinny. And I'm going to change the color to pretty much the same blue. And I want to change the joints on this outline from round, which is the default, to square, so they're nice and sharp. I'm going to turn off my overlays real quick so I can see the width better on this rectangle. I'm actually going to, let's bring it up a hair. All right, now we want to add a behavior to this outline rectangle. I'm going to make sure it's selected in my project pane. I'm going to go to behaviors, shape, and I'm going to go to right on. And let me drag my playhead down my timeline so you can see what happens. It actually writes itself on. Now let me play it back for you in real time. So it's going pretty slow. I can make it go faster by changing the size of this right on bar. I want it to come in a little later, and I want it to happen a little faster. So I'm going to shrink that down. So now we want to play with the stroke length. So as you can see, it completes the rectangle entirely and then just holds there. We actually want something else to happen. We're going to change the stroke length to, let's say, 46. And so now you'll see what happens is look what happens. The front end is being chased by the tail end. And then it stops though. We're at 46%, right? So 50% would be from this corner to that corner to that corner. We're at 46, so it stops right here. So we actually want to keyframe that. I'm going to go back a few frames. Look at my timeline here. I'm going to add a keyframe at that 46%. And then I'm going to go to the end of the write-on. And I'm going to make that 0. So watch what happens. It chases itself and then it shrinks. Now we want to add like kind of a light effect to this outline. So it's got a little bit of a glitz to it. So we're going to make sure we're selected on that rectangle in the project pane. This time we're going to go to filters. We're going to go down to glow and we're going to select glint. Now you don't see much yet, but we're going to make some changes here. First, I want to up the exposure. I want to change the color to more of like a purpley lavender kind of situation. And then we're going to dial up the tint. We're going to make the glint size like 1. Streaks we're going to keep at 1. The glow amount will go down to 2. And the intensity we're going to dial up. Now you can see something really happening. And we're going to pull down that color fringing. I think it's like too purple. All right, we're getting somewhere. Next, we actually need to, of course, add the text for the name. So we're going to go on over to the text tool. And this time, believe it or not, what I'm going to do is just type in my name as all one word. Jenn Jager. And we're going to change this font to Roboto. We're going to make sure it's centered. So in our format window under the inspector tab, we're going to make this centered. And let's go on over to properties and reset that parameter. So it really is just like dead centered to start with. Let's go back over to text and let's make it bigger. Now, in order to give some separation between my first name and my last name, I'm actually going to make part of it bold and part of it just a regular weight font. So if you want to change the attributes of characters in your text individually, you need to use what's called transform glyph. So let me show you how to do that. You want to go down to your tools window here and we're going to select transform glyph. And now when you select certain words here in your inspector window, let me turn on my overlays because now you can't see. Okay, see how you get this little box around the J? We're actually going to highlight my last name here. And now I've got boxes around all of these letters. And now I can modify them independently of my first name here. So we started with Roboto Black. We're actually going to go take this to Roboto Light. Now I'm going to turn off Transform Glyph. I'm going to go back to my normal arrow, Transform here. And let's add an effect to this. I'm going to go to Behaviors, Text Subtle, and hit Shimmer In. And you see what that does. Now we need to add my subtitle, my subtext. So again, I'm going to reach for the text tool. I'm just going to click in here and we're going to go. So let's change this. I want to go to Transform Glyph again. And this time I want to select the first word, creative. And I want to make this one light. Go back to the normal transform tool. So we're modifying all of the text. And let's just make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to center it again. And let's align it here. And now what we want to do is highlight this text with a movement. So I'm going to select Creative Director in my project pane. We're going to go to Behaviors. We're going to go to Highlighter. And I'm going to select Pirouette. And it's going to make this text do like this really cute little twirl. I'm going to make this text start at the beginning of my timeline. very close, but again, how is this name super coming in? Let's have the whole thing kind of scale up and bounce up really quick. I could do this with the overshoot, but I think I'm just going to keyframe this one to keep it simple. So what we want to do is select our main group again, of course, in the project pane. We're going to head on over to properties. We're going to make the scale 0. We're going to add a keyframe in that first frame of our timeline here. We're going to make the scale 0. I'm going to arrow over with my keyboard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm going to add another keyframe and I'm going to make this value 103 instead of 100. And then I'm going to arrow over 2 more frames in my timeline with my keyboard using those arrow keys. So 1, 2, and then I'm going to add another keyframe and then I'm going to make this 100. So it kind of like comes in and bounces just a hair. We might have to play with the timing of these keyframes a little bit. Let's see. Yeah, I think these 2 keyframes need to be separated a hair. I'm going to zoom in my timeline by using this little zoom feature here at the very bottom of the screen. I'm going to select this one keyframe. I'm going to drag it down a little. I think I'm going to move the right on this rectangle a little further down so that the text is still pirouetting when this starts. Okay, and then in order to get rid of this super, I'm actually not going to have it fade out. Let's do like the exact opposite motion of the scaling in. So let's bring it to about 7 seconds. I'm going to dial back the size of my group. And I'm going to arrow back 14 frames. We're going to make the scale 100. We're going to keep that scale. We're going to add this keyframe. I'm going to arrow over 4 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to go back up to 103. And then we should arrow over 10 more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we're going to make that 0. So let's see how that goes. Good. Okay, so as you noticed, the name super is like full screen center on our screen, which isn't really where you would want to have a lower third. It's not really a lower third there. So there's the couple things you could do. You could export this movie on its own and then in Final Cut place it wherever you want, which I would maybe recommend. If you wanted to change it here in Apple Motion, what we want to do is, because we just created all these keyframes on our main group, we actually need to create another group to preserve those keyframes we just made. So go up to your main project file, your main group here, right click, hit group again, and now we can take this super and we can scale it down and maneuver it, move it, do other things to it without messing up everything that we've built inside. Okay, pretty cool. So if you're gonna export this again, you wanna export as an Alpha ProRes 4444, and you wanna make sure that you turn off, if you have like a dummy shot in there, you wanna make sure you turn that off, obviously, so you're not exporting that as well. So what did you guys think of these 2 different supers? You can customize these any way you want, but hopefully I give you some ideas of like what might fit for your client or for your own projects. If you can create lower thirds in Apple Motion, you can really do anything. So I hope these gave you a lot of ideas and a jumping off point about how to start. Now, if you're interested in checking out that third super, come on over to my Patreon community and you'll get to see how I make this third super. And again, don't forget that next week I'm going to show you how to publish these to Final Cut. Thank you so much for watching.